Hello, summoners and superfans. My name is TVSkyn. And, why is League of Legends lore the way it is? I spend quite a lot of time talking about it on this channel, analyzing it, criticizing it, contextualizing it, and one of the consistent issues that comes up, especially when talking about older characters, is that their lore is either practically non-existent or a complete mess. League of Legends is one of the biggest video games in the world, created by a giant game company with a near infinite supply of money, talent, and resources. So why is it that even after almost 9 years of non-stop success and with over 140 characters in the game, that Riot has not been able to wrangle their fiction? Well, it's a complicated question, and one which Riot usually answers by posting apologies, promises to do better, and we'll release something new, #soon. But I wanted to know more, and I wanted some better answers. To that end, I've spoken with several current and former developers at Riot who've told me about the internal approaches to lore at various points in the company's history, and I've dived into the archives of story material that Riot have released over the years, as well as articles, interviews, and testimonies from certain recent developments, and I think I've come up with a more complete picture of the conditions and circumstances that led to the 2014 Total Lore reboot and Riot's consistent difficulty in telling stories to the kind of standard you would expect from one of the most successful video games of all time. Before we get into it, however, this video was voted on by my supporters on Patreon who have waited for far too long. So I'd like to lead off with an apology for the long delay, as well as a heartfelt thank you for the support you're giving me that lets me make videos like this at all. So, with that out of the way, let's first answer a rather important question. In the very early days of the development of Splatoon, the game looked like this. Black and white boxes running around shooting black and white at each other. No inklings, no hip-hop aesthetic, no pop idols, no fashion, no music, no creative interpretations of sea life, no nefarious Octarians trying to steal the great sapfish. This is because a lot of Nintendo's design follows a philosophy of developing gameplay mechanics first and then inventing story and aesthetics to fit around it once they have a game that feels good to play. But if you want to know why the lore matters, why the story and aesthetics and art of a game matters, well, if Nintendo had released that early build of Splatoon with none of the visuals, none of the aesthetics, none of the personality, charm, and music, none of that, then even if the gameplay was completely identical between them, which one would you rather pay $60 to play? So, League of Legends was a Dota clone. Riot prefers to call it a MOBA, but in 2008, when League first launched into pre-alpha, it was, in most of the ways that matter, a clone of the popular fan-made Warcraft 3 mode, Defense of the Ancients. In fact, one of the early lead designers on League of Legends, Steve Ginso-Feek, the guy whose name is on the Rageblade, is also one of the people behind the popular Dota All-Stars variant of that original mod. League was a Dota clone, except in one very important way. While it lifted most of its mechanics from a Warcraft game mode, it applied them to a different IP. Sure, Ashe is functionally the Drow Ranger, but she has a different name, different story, some different colors, and they didn't use the same character model, so try as they might, Blizzard couldn't shut the project down or sue for royalties. Now, I'm simplifying, obviously, but one of the extremely important functions of lore when League of Legends was first released was to distinguish the game, creatively and legally, from the game that had inspired it. It needed a narrative and a visual identity because without one, it would never, ever be more than just a Dota clone. But introducing lore to a set of mechanics like Dota comes with a problem. All video games have a certain level of artificiality to them, which requires suspension of disbelief. But some mechanics are more believable than others, and some can break immersion completely. In Call of Duty, clicking the mouse to shoot a gun is a good mechanical representation of pulling the trigger, and it helps immerse you in the game experience, but an on-screen prompt telling you to press F to pay respects to your dead friend during an in-game funeral is not only not a good mechanical representation of the emotional act of mourning, it's also a hilariously obvious example of game mechanics intruding on a narrative and undercutting its emotional power. So, in a MOBA, why do endlessly respawning minions run down lanes? Why does each team have a base? Why are there turrets? Why are these powerful strangers with superpowers fighting together on random teams? And why is there a scoreboard keeping track of how often they die? In fact, how can people die and then just come back to life like nothing happened? In Dota, the answer to those questions is the same as the answer to the question, why do soccer players have to kick the ball instead of picking it up? There's no reason. Those are just the rules of the game. If they picked up the ball and ran with it, it wouldn't be soccer anymore. It would be probably American football. And if you take away the minions, the item shop, the respawning, the towers, and the lanes from Dota, it stops being Dota. It becomes just a bunch of random Warcraft 3 assets uselessly sitting around on a map. In Dota and in soccer, the rules are the game. But Riot couldn't copy that answer for League of Legends. Since the rules are the game of Dota, you need something else to be your own thing. And so the designers at Riot made a simple, but under the circumstances brilliant, creative decision. If the rules and the mechanics of the game make it impossible to pretend you are not playing a game, then let's tell a story about playing a game. Because you, the player, are a summoner. What's a summoner? Oh, well, it's a person who sits in a room and controls a powerful champion and makes them fight other powerful champions being controlled by other summoners. Why do you make them fight? Well, because you're playing in a tournament, the League of Legends. That's why the game is played on a symmetrical playfield. It's why each team is color-coded. It's why everybody gets magic towers that only shoots the other guys. It's why you get a scoreboard and an announcer calling out the big plays for the audience. You're not just playing a game in real life, you're playing a game in the game. It's simple, but it works. It creates a narrative framework to justify its mechanics, and it differentiates League of Legends legally and creatively from the game it's spinning off from. So, how did it all work? Once upon a time, there was a world called Runeterra. And on Runeterra was a great big continent called Valoran, and on Valoran was a whole host of nations, cultures, and city-states. Oh, and also magic, really powerful magic. Perhaps inevitably, the peoples of Valoran got involved in warfare. But due to the use of powerful rune magic, those wars became so devastating that they threatened the very life of the planet. Unnatural storms, earthquakes, and monsters, all of them fallout from magical weapons of mass destruction. Faced with this threat of mutually assured destruction, a group of powerful sorcerers and magicians from all over the world decided to invent another way. An alternative to all-out war, where political struggles could be settled safely. They formed the League of Legends, a grand tournament of arms where each political faction could send their summoners and champions to fight for the political interests of their home states. Carefully controlled, managed, and backed up by the immense collective power of the sorcerers who controlled the League from within the Institute of War. States would accept the outcome of League games or face certain destruction. And so, champions and summoners flocked to the League, some voluntarily and some by magic and entrapment, some to fight for their nations, states, and cities, and some to fight for their own secret agendas, and war on Valoran became almost non-existent. The League of Legends becomes not only Valoran's greatest political problem-solving arena, it also becomes its greatest and most unifying form of crowd entertainment, with League matches taking place and being broadcast via magical viewing crystals all over the continent. Loud and proud fan cultures spring up, cheering every last hit and kill for their favorite champions and home teams. Champions like Jax and Janna become celebrities in their own rights, while the likes of Morgana, Ryze, and Karthus fight for reasons of their own, and monsters like Cho'Gath and Nocturne are bound by summoner magic to serve as champions for the games. This was the basic lore state of League of Legends up until about 2014. Magic World War II caused the creation of the Magic UN, except instead of a security council, it had Bloodsport. League of Legends is, in essence, a Cold War parable, with champions and matches on Summoner's Rift standing in for satellite conflicts between world powers and legendary rune magic playing the part of nuclear weapons. Now, remember how we talked about that one of the advantages of the original Dota is that it leans so heavily into just being a game that it can basically do whatever it wants and never have to explain itself because it's just a game? Well, when League of Legends invented itself a complex lore, it intentionally surrendered that advantage. League of Legends does have to explain itself. It does need to know what a Nexus is, why everybody's fighting, where everybody came from, what they want, and why it matters. Because if the thing that makes your game not just a clone is that it's trying to tell a unique story about all the mechanics it's borrowing, then you can't have the Egyptian god of the afterlife fighting two furries, an angel, a creepy schoolgirl, and the Violator from Spawn without some sort of explanation for how the hell they all got there. It's not enough to say, it's just a game, because if you do, you become just a Dota clone again. You need to have an explanation, even if it's a flimsy one. And that's another problem that Riot solves with the League of Legends and the powerful summoners of the Institute of War. Why is definitely not Anubis there? Well, summoners. Why can everybody use an identical set of magical abilities like Flash and Ignite? Summoners. Why is Soraka and Warwick on the same team when they hate each other? Summoners. The early lore of League of Legends thus created a flexible context for Riot to bring together a large and interesting cast of characters to use in their gameplay. Now, yeah, a lot of the old lore was not very well written, and yes, a lot of the characters they invented were ultimately a rather flat collection of vague pop culture tropes held together with spit and duct tape, but it worked just well enough to keep the game going. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional, and as an added bonus, the lore provided a springboard for the growing League of Legends fanbase to start producing fan art, fanfiction cosplays, memes, and all the other things that help people engage with a video game even when they aren't playing it. And this has a lot of value. So in our story so far, theoretically, all is well with League of Legends and Riot Games. They have a distinctive lore, giving their game a unique flavor, setting it apart from the mods that inspired it. They have a large and growing roster of characters, each of them bringing with them interesting backstories, and they have a solid foundation from which they can actively explore a vibrant and dynamic story with an ever-evolving narrative for years to come. Right? I've praised the simple and elegant solution that Riot used to get League of Legends' narrative off the ground, but let's be clear about something. League of Legends was never really a story game. The story exists, but its purpose is external to the gameplay itself. That is, it provides an explanation for the action within the game, but it's not really part of the game. However many League matches you play as Garen, you will never move the political needle of Valorant in favor of Demacia. Play as Cho'Gath all you want, you'll never get him closer to his goal of breaking free from the League's control and consuming everything in his path. This is reflected in early lore efforts as well. The Journal of Justice was a fictional in-universe publication relaying the results of League matches and speculating on the politics and personal lives of champions and notable figures in the style of a tabloid. It was a natural evolution of the idea that League is a popular spectator sport, and over the course of 31 issues, Riot attempted to use the journal to build out the internal lore of the League of Legends universe, reporting in its final issues on Swain's ascendance to Tyrant of Noxus. The journal was discontinued, however, by the start of Season 2, with senior creative designer Riot Raven explaining that using in-universe journalism to tell stories just became much too confining. Other efforts to expand the lore included a special in-game event called Noxus vs. Ionia Rematch, where a fictional political conflict between Noxus and Ionia was going to be resolved by the League of Legends. It took the form of a special show match between notable real-life players. The match favored Ionia and was commemorated by the Ionian Boots of Lucidity, which persist in the game to this day. Theoretically, this victory ensured Ionian dominance over 3 contested regions previously conquered by Noxus, but very little was ever done to follow up on it, and Riot has not held similar events since. The lore was running up against some hard problems of sheer scale. Since the day of release, Riot released new champions for the game at an absolutely blistering pace, with a new champion added to the game every 2 weeks, a pace they kept up until the release of Lissandra in 2013. What this meant for the lore was that every 2 weeks saw the introduction of a new storyline, a fresh set of narrative loose ends, which made maintaining any kind of overarching storyline all but impossible. Imagine trying to balance any grand narrative about Runeterran politics and culture when every 2 weeks a new superpowered demigod drops out of the ether and you have to pretend like they had been there all along, but they just weren't doing anything important to the storyline because reasons. Garen and Lux are brother and sister, but released into the game almost 6 months apart, and Garen's initial lore had no hint of her existence. By the end of 2009, League of Legends had just over 40 champions to keep track of. A year later, it was closing in on 70, and come 2018, it's doubled from that to over 140. How do you tell stories under conditions like that? The answer, as it turns out, is that mostly you don't. League of Legends gameplay wasn't very conducive to telling character stories, and efforts like the Journal of Justice simply couldn't keep up with the rapid pace of changes or the scope of the world that was being built. For a very long time indeed, League of Legends narrative was a thing on the margins, existing in champion teasers and biography pages because the game itself simply couldn't support it. And by 2012, this began to have some consequences. In the beginning, new champions joined the League in order to advance the interests of their region or pursue their own agendas, but by the middle of 2012, the official lores and biographies of new champions stopped mentioning the League, and they stopped mentioning the summoners and how they were supposed to be connected to the champion's personal story. Varus, on his original release in 2012, was the last champion to make any official mention of the League of Legends in his lore. What this means is that Darius, Draven, Jace, Syra, Diana, Rengar, Syndra, Kha'Zix, Elise, Set, Nami, Vi, Thresh, Quinn, Zac, Lissandra, Aatrox, Lucian, Jinx, Yasuo, Vel'Koz, and Braum all released into a game that officially maintained that the League of Legends is the center of its fiction, but their biographies and their stories were written with the implicit assumption that either the League didn't exist or it was irrelevant. The lore had effectively been retconned already, and yet it took Riot over 2 years to make that retcon official. In the 2014 dev blog Exploring Runeterra, Riot lays out its own argument for why the lore had to be rebooted. Every new champion needed a reason to join and remain in the league, and as their number grew, the result was that over time the world started to feel, well, small, and eventually less interesting. The institutions we designed fostered creative stagnation, limiting the ways that champions, factions, and Runeterra itself could grow and change. Furthermore, the very idea of all-powerful summoners made champions little more than puppets manipulated by godlike powers. The background we created to explain in-game action was ultimately restricting the potential narrative development of the game's defining characters. Faced with these limitations, our use of narrative elements tightly bound to the original vision, journals of justice, judgments, etc., dwindled because they felt fundamentally restrictive to our hopes for a more vibrant and expansive world. The post is essentially an admission of what had clearly been obvious internally since 2012. By structuring the entire game around the League of Legends as an in-universe institution, they were beginning to strain the limitations of what the concept could support. As I pointed out previously, however many matches you play with Garen, and however great your win rate, you're never going to make an actual difference in the conflict with Noxus. And the strain that the League's supremacy over the game world was putting on the lore is obvious in the story of a character like Hecarim, who, in his original story, arrives on the shores of Demacia as a terrifying herald, laying waste to all that stand before him and proclaiming the horrors of the Shadow Wilds, only to then march up to the League of Legends and demand to play bloodless gladiatorial games for the entertainment of sports audiences across the world. And he was not alone in suffering this narrative dissonance. Characters like Skarner, Seraph, LeBlanc, Vladimir, Ezreal, Swain all suffered from lore concepts that were inevitably undercut by their subordination to the Institute of War, or their stories were just conveniently roadblocked by some pressing need that coincidentally only the summoners of the League could provide. Now, for a roster of a couple of dozen champions, this could be justified, but as the number of champions grew, so too did the number of outlandish justifications for why this hero or demigod or horror from beyond the Veil of the Stars absolutely had to fight in the League for their story to continue. And so we reached the lore retcon of 2014 when Riot finally lets the Institute of War, the League of Legends, and the Cold War metaphor it represents go completely. With the binding framework of the universe now undone, dozens and dozens of champions go through the process of having their stories hastily retconned to remove references to the League, robbing most of them of the vast majority of their lore content. More recent characters like Zed, Vi, and Lissandra are the least affected, having been created with stories that give them plenty of connection to the world outside the League, while champions like Fiddlesticks, Shaco, Jax, Poppy, Twisted Fate, and others were robbed of some of their fundamental story concepts and character motivations. The retcon left the lore in a state of meandering, directionless chaos. The 2014 lore retcon should be seen as both an admission of a certain kind of defeat, as well as a dawning realization that the state of story in League of Legends was unsustainable, and Riot's frustrating slowness in addressing this unsustainability, I mean seriously, it's 4 years later and they're just beginning to get the lore under some kind of control, has to be seen as the natural consequence of the circumstances that led to the game's phenomenal success in the first place. For the purposes of this video, I was able to reach out to a number of former and current Rioters who gave me a lot of insight into the lore and character development process at Riot at various points in time. However, the people I talked to are subject to non-disclosure agreements, and while they were okay talking to me informally and off the record, some of them asked that their information not be included in the video. Now, I can't unknow what I've been told, and so some of my conclusions in this video are going to be based on information that I can't actually present to you. I'm gonna do my best to make it clear when I'm relaying information directly and when I'm engaging in informed speculation, but just bear in mind that not everything in this video is hard evidence, indisputable fact, and people who I didn't get to talk to, who worked on the same projects as my sources, might have different perspectives. Anyway, the information and stories I got from my sources, alongside some of my own observations, have painted an interesting picture of Riot as a company. Rapidly expanding and drunk on its own success, their internal culture and business priorities ended up putting lore, story, and characters kind of on the bottom rung, without a workable plan for their development. To begin with, Riot is a ridiculously unlikely success story. A small team of indies creating a standalone clone of a Warcraft 3 mod that had 100,000 people playing it within 2 months of its release. The company ballooned to an international powerhouse of a games publisher with offices on half of the world's continent and a multinational esports circuit in less than 10 years. In a feature article on Polygon, Mark Merrill describes the process of growing League of Legends as a building the plane while flying experience. As the company expanded, it was rapidly hiring people to establish the kind of infrastructure that other publishers have had years, if not decades, to develop. Teams and departments would be established, restructured, reshuffled, and revamped rapidly to meet changing demands, and amid that kind of chaos, developing a functional and reliable structure for lore development was a major challenge, further compounded by the company simply not prioritizing the issue in the long term. To illustrate what I mean, according to one source I talked to, Riot did not have an internal archive dedicated to tracking the lore and story and assets of League of Legends until 2015. Until that point, writers and artists at Riot had been reliant on fragmented asset archives divided across individual artists' computers, and if they wanted to know the lore state of the game, had to essentially piece it together from the many various places it had been published online. According to my source, rank-and-file Rioters would frequently be largely unfamiliar with most of the game's lore, even if they were working on creative projects like art assets and new champions. And if people at Riot wanted to go back through the published story content of the game, they would have to rely on community efforts like the League of Legends Wikia or lore master posts compiled on the game's boards. Now, take a moment to let that sink in. League of Legends launched in 2009, and it took them until 2015, 6 years and a full year after the retcon, to begin the process of properly archiving and structuring the lore content that had formed the narrative underpinnings of the only game that Riot Games were publishing. They had no properly organized, tagged, searchable database of their own work, presenting a huge barrier to the development of coherent lore, since any given team of creatives might only have access to limited parts of the established canon. According to my source, the project to finally create a proper lore archive ran into multiple problems with assets being mislabeled, misplaced, or simply erased. They relayed an anecdote of at least one set of original splash art source files being lost forever when the artist who had created them left the company, and per company policy their workstation was wiped of all data without first doing a backup. They also described a complete lack of coherent company policy on preservation and categorization of assets, leading to a lot of work time going into sorting through utterly unorganized archive dump folders. Staffers assigned to clean up the assets would have to go character by character on spreadsheets, manually searching through text documents to try and cross-reference everything and establish something like a working canon for the game. Similarly, the various teams at Riot also went through stages of disagreement about defining what counts as a piece of lore in the game. My source describes occasions where artists on one team would resist the idea of classifying things like jewelry, clothes, and accessories as part of the game's storytelling, and fail to provide assets of such things to the archive. Champions and concepts would be designed with costumes and clothing that did not fully take into account previously established aesthetics or even impact on previously established lore. Let's be clear about this. The situation described by my source is dire. Parts of it has been corroborated by other people I've talked to, while there's been some dispute about other details, but regardless of the nitpicking, I was floored to hear that Riot had been working for that long without a properly organized, dedicated internal lore archive. It shows a frankly staggering lack of regard for the importance of narrative to their video game, and it does a lot to explain how the game ended up in a state where it was more expedient to simply reboot the entire universe than to try and evolve or make sense of the story as it had been up to that point. So, how did it come to that? I talked to a former writer at Riot who told me that the primary difficulty for a lot of what the writing teams wanted to do was structural resistance. That is, the official policy at Riot was that lore was supposed to be the third pillar of game design alongside gameplay and art, but in reality, the rapid expansion of the company and the escalating needs of ventures like their massive investment into esports meant that the narrative teams and lore departments just got deprioritized. The company could only recruit and onboard so many people at a time, and most of the new hires went to other projects. It's not that anyone at the company didn't want there to be a good story in the game, it's rather that on a resource level, it was a matter of other projects taking priority. My source was unwilling to speak ill of their former colleagues, which I completely understand. It described the situation more in terms of good intentions, frustrated by circumstance, than active mismanagement or incompetence on the part of anyone at the company. So it's pretty easy to make excuses for Riot. They were growing rapidly, they had all kinds of projects in the work, they had to do esports, they were flying by the seat of their pants, etc. And yeah, that's true, but they could have done better. They could have done a lot better. And the way that I know that is because they did. With everything else in the game. They got their esport off the ground, they released dozens of champions, and they rolled out balance patches like every other week. They marketed and supported their game like crazy. Those other areas of game development had exactly the same challenges, but they did far, far better. And therefore, I don't think you can just hand wave away or forgive their failures to curate and manage the story of their game. Riot made conscious decisions about how it distributed its efforts. It made conscious decisions about its resources, and those choices resulted in the absolute mess that the lore became and has remained up until almost the present day. So let's make the thesis of this video absolutely clear. Riot screwed up the lore. They had the opportunity to do it right, and they failed. And the lore teams at Riot have spent most of the last 4 years just cleaning up after that failure. And in order to explain not just how that failure happened, but why, we do have to talk about... So recently there's been some stories in the news. Some really, really awful stories. If you're watching this video, presumably you know about them already, but TLDR, Kotaku recently published an article containing interviews and testimony from about 24 former and current Rioters about the culture of sexism and bigotry that has pervaded Riot Games seemingly since its inception. After the article was published, at least 9 more men and women and at least a couple of dozen former and current Rioters that I know about came forward on various social medias to share their own stories and more or less unanimously corroborate the findings of the article. The picture it paints of Riot as a workplace is, let's put it gently, not great. Now, for the purposes of this video, I also do need to discuss the internal culture at Riot, and I'm gonna be relying in part on some pieces of the Kotaku article and information from the people who have come forward since. But before I do, I need to clarify a few things about that. This video discusses the impact that the culture at Riot had on the lore and story development for the game. But nobody who watches this video should come away with the impression that that is the important part of the conversation. The real consequence of Riot's culture is the impact it had on the people who worked there, the experiences they went through, and the injustices that were done to them. There's a link in the description to a curated list of articles, responses, and testimonies that have come out in the wake of the Kotaku article, and I strongly encourage you all to read it and be reminded of the importance of holding Riot to account for that. We good? We good. All right. Get ready for a lot of quotes and citations. Riot has always been adamant, and loudly so, that their mission is to put player experience first. Riot co-founder Mark Merrill, in an interview with Variety magazine, crystallizes this idea as such. "It is drilled into our employees that player focus is the thing that we aspire to be our North Star," Merrill said. "That's why we hire gamers, and only gamers, because the difference between a great decision and a terrible one is how it relates to players." This is echoed in an official statement from Riot to Kotaku on the same subject that reads, "To ensure our aspirational culture becomes a reality and isn't lost in translation, we must over-index on cultural reinforcement. We believe hiring gamers is critical to our success." Riot and all of their products cater to and hire from a demographic they like to call core gamers. So what is a core gamer? Well, it's not explicitly defined on the Riot Games website, but the Riot Manifesto gives us a few clues. "We care about and obsess over every part of the player experience, from your first game to your 1,000th win. From installation to player support to esports broadcasts, every interaction point matters. Games are an important part of our lives, and we proudly call ourselves gamers. By playing lots of games, especially our own, we deliver player value by knowing what players value." The country manager for Singapore and Malaysia at Riot Games, a Rioter by the name of Benjamin Pomereux, wrote a blog post on his LinkedIn in early 2017 giving advice to people considering applying to work at Riot. And in it, he lays out an even more direct definition of the core gamer for us. "At Riot, we make games for what we call core gamers. Not that we don't think that anybody who plays games is a gamer, but we build a specific type of games. League is a multiplayer game, hard to master, competitive. It is not for everyone. If you just play Candy Crush, you are a gamer for sure, and Candy Crush is a well-designed, immensely successful game. It's just not the type of game that we do. The players who like our game spend a lot of time playing. They have high expectations and quality standards because gaming is their passion and an important piece of their life. They can tell when a feature has been designed by someone who does not understand his product, and they would not like it. Building products that are the passion of other people is not like building a commodity. You can translate this idea to people who have a passion for movies. Do you think they would pay $15 to go to a theater and watch a movie made by a director who does not like films? Probably not. So, no, you do not need to be a LoL player, but we are looking for people with an affinity for MMOs, competitive shooters, or MOBAs in general, etc. Of course, we expect that you will have played LoL and have an educated opinion on it, because it would be unprofessional otherwise. And unfortunately, it won't be an educated opinion if you've only played 30 minutes. Now, there is of course absolutely nothing wrong with any of this. Riot can hire however they like, and having a strong customer-focused company mission is not at all a bad thing. The issue, however, arises when single-minded hiring practices and company priorities have unintended consequences. Again, the most important of those consequences are the hostile, painful working conditions that dozens of women and men have come forward to talk about, the sexist tech bro culture, harassment, and abuse. Aside from that, however, single-minded hiring practices and a focus on maintaining an internal monoculture also creates a number of other biases. For example, let's say Riot had to make a hypothetical choice between spending resources on balancing the gameplay to be more enjoyable or improving the story and narrative. As a gamer-focused core gamers come first company, the choice is obvious. You improve the gameplay, the thing that gamers care about. Now, in real life, of course, things are rarely that simple. The team that works on game balance doesn't work on the story, and budgets can be accommodated flexibly. It's not a binary of one thing or the other, and you can do both. But say you're a game company, and your game is taking off. Thousands and thousands of new players every week. They need tech support, the game needs to be balanced, infrastructure needs to be built, updates, new content, community management, publishing deals need to be worked out, there's financing, accounting, banking issues, everything needs money, everything needs staff. Now, let's say you're also an idealistic company with a very specific idea about the kinds of people you want to hire, and this very specific idea slows your hiring down. It makes it hard to expand. It creates a long onboarding process, and a number of hires just don't work out because they don't fit the culture that you want. You need more hires. You need to expand to serve your players. So, do you take a chance on hiring the risky pick? The person who might not be a perfect fit for your company profile, but who has a different perspective, a different background, a different, dare I say it, gender? Or do you hire the safe bet? The guy who shows up at the interview and fits in right away. The guy who you think you can be sure will fit in because he conforms. The pressure was there to do that kind of thing, and according to the testimonies we've heard from inside the company, they did. Women were turned down for being too different, for being too outside the norm, for not fitting in to the culture. According to Kotaku, preferencing Riot's definition of core gamers during hiring means drawing in employees from a larger pool of men than women. Avid players of MOBAs and first-person shooter fans are typically men. Game data company Quantic Foundry surveyed over 270,000 gamers worldwide and reported that only 10% of gamers who play MOBAs are female. For first-person shooters, that number is 7%. Without examining why these gaming genres are heavily male, Riot's apparent job candidate expectations can create a very stratified workplace. Riot had a hiring bias, both intentionally and unintentionally. They had practical and idealistic incentive to prioritize hiring and resources for departments that dealt directly with the practical work of expanding the companies and its services, and they had a cultural bias that skewed them in favor of hiring people who would contribute directly to the player experience. As one of my sources put it when describing the challenges facing the lore development at Riot, it was a question of manpower and resources in a company that was growing exponentially pretty much every day. We did the absolute best we could with what we had at the time, especially as most of us were focused on releasing champions back when the cadence of release was much higher. When I started, we were releasing a champion every 2 weeks. The problem was that Riot was a small company that grew incredibly fast. When companies explode and rapidly expand like Riot did, it's natural that some things are lost in the scramble. League had taken off as an esport, so a lot of resources, manpower, and overall company focus naturally fell to gameplay/design. If you're a writer, a really good writer, that means you've dedicated a good portion of your life to something that, well, isn't gaming. And given that your interest lies in narrative and storytelling, then while you may be a gamer, you would be likely to have a preference for games that are about the things that you're interested in, that is narrative, rather than competitive play or, core gaming. Now, of course, Riot's recruiting knows that, and they make sure to hire writers who aren't just full-time core gamers. But those writers then have to pitch their projects and ask for their funding from people who are core gamers and who don't share the same concerns about the importance of story, of narrative, of building, characterization, and long-term engagement. So, the same circumstances that created a gamer bro monoculture also created a hostile environment for anything and anyone who didn't fit the priorities and concerns of that monoculture. Whether that was women or, good lord, less importantly, the development of a full-featured and engaging narrative and story content. Not because someone at the top was twirling their mustache, laughing maniacally at all the evil they were doing, but because the system that they built with the best of intentions turned out to have some really harmful biases built into it that they didn't deal with in anything like an appropriate way. This, I think, is why the story that had worked so well early on fell apart and never got anywhere. This is why the Journal of Justice didn't work out. It's why Noxus vs. Ionia never happened again. It's why they didn't have an internal lore archive. It's why the core concept underpinning the lore was abandoned 2 years before the retcon was official. It's why the lore was retconned in the first place, and it's why it's taken them 4 years just to clean up most of it again. The Riot Manifesto doesn't mention story, lore, narrative, world building, or immersion, but it does mention installation, player support, and esports broadcasts. Riot's monoculture had priorities, and those priorities left lore, story, and anyone who isn't a straight man at the bottom of the ladder. Let's return to one of the questions I asked early on. Why is the lore even important? In that section, I answered that question from almost a purely practical perspective, namely, that the lore was necessary as a tool to make League of Legends a full IP, that is, an intellectual property, rather than just a well-polished Dota clone. But let's talk for a second about why the lore and story of a game like League of Legends matters, not just as a practical feature of game development, but from a wider perspective, from a cultural perspective. Nobody could possibly have known that League would get as big as it did, or that it would happen so quickly. According to the people who worked at Riot at the time, they all thought they had a good game on their hands, but the explosion of success that followed its release blew everybody away. It was, as Mark Merrill put it, a building the plane while flying experience. So the pressures of growing the business and maintaining the game and the desire to maintain a vision for their company culture, well, it makes sense that it all combined in unintended ways to cripple the lore in favor of other priorities. The company that Riot was, and decided to be, probably couldn't have done any better. But they should have. Now, the argument I'm about to make isn't objective, and in some ways it's not even rational. It's not based on any universal laws or commonly acceptable standards. It's an emotional argument, and in some ways a moral argument. And it is, in my opinion anyway, also a reasonable argument. Stories matter. They just do. I don't know how to prove that, except, we still read Beowulf. Over 1,000 years since some monk bothered to write it down, we're still reading it and being influenced by it, and it shows up in our media. We're still adapting the Odyssey, and the Iliad, and Oedipus Rex, and Thor, the Norse god of thunder. He was invented 2,000 years ago by my people, and now he's starring in the most lucrative movie franchise there has ever been. Stories matter. They matter to us as human beings. We read billions of novels each year because stories matter. We watch billions of hours of Netflix and Hulu and HBO because stories matter. The Kardashians are famous because, like it or not, stories are powerful and stories matter. And so when you have an audience of millions of people who are giving you their time and their attention and their money, then call me Uncle Ben, but I think you have a responsibility to that audience to tell them good stories. Not just placeholder functional IP to make sure nobody sues you for making a Dota clone. Good stories. Stories that get to people, that move something in them. And not in the sense that they have to educate anyone or make them better people or whatever, because down that road lies some dark territory, but in the sense that they try to say something meaningful, something true, that they express something that matters in some way, whatever way that may be, just something. And League of Legends already does this, or at least it tries. Aatrox, in his new lore, is essentially a parable about the horrors of solitary confinement and what it does to a soul. Asir touches on the difficult balancing act of what it means to be a ruler. Diana embodies the pain of being rejected by your society just for being different. Hell, even Amumu, poor friendless Amumu, tries to tell a story about the visceral, emotional importance of just having a friend. League of Legends tries, and League of Legends, for all the money Riot has, all the influence, all the talent that Riot has access to, League of Legends fails. It fails to tell stories with the kind of care and attention that the audience deserves. It fails to tell the kinds of stories that it has a responsibility to try and tell. And I'm not the dude who sits in holy judgment, pronouncing divine sentence on how those stories should be told and what criteria they should be judged on, but I don't need to be ordained by any god with any special wisdom to look at the state of lore in League of Legends today and conclude that that's not good enough yet. They could have done better, and they should have done so much better. They should have tried harder. They could have prioritized it more. They should have made some sacrifices for it, even if that meant compromising a little bit on the gameplay or a little bit on the esports broadcast. One of my sources told me that at Riot, at least in theory, story was one of the 3 pillars of game development. Story, art, and gameplay. These were the grand foundations of the League of Legends experiment. That was the policy, but it wasn't the reality. And League of Legends is weaker for it, because monoculture breeds monoculture. When Riot failed to make good on its stated ambitions for a solid narrative, they began to alienate the part of their audience that cared about it. They began to train us, the audience, not to expect ambitious storytelling from League. That this is not what League is about. Here, have 3 paragraphs of biography and 600 pages of patch notes because that's what League is about. Oh, no, wait, give us back that bio, actually. We just retconned the entire lore out of existence, and it's gonna take us 4 years to put it back together, but hey, hope you stick around for that! If I sound bitter, it's because, well, I am. Biggest video game in the universe, with a stated ambition to tell good and interesting stories, and they just dropped it on the floor. To be honest, if it wasn't for the esport, I don't think I would have stuck around, but I did. And because I stuck around, I have decided to care about it. I've decided to care that this game becomes better than it is. That these characters, who even through the disappointments I've come to love, get the stories that they deserve. So, to round out this segment, let's return to the practical argument. Because building a story isn't just about catering to the moral convictions of mega nerds like me, it's also about building a legacy that will last. And Riot knows that, because even if they fail to make good on it, there's a reason that story was one of the 3 foundational pillars of their game design. Because stories matter. Not just emotionally, but practically, and financially too. League of Legends the video game will die someday. Riot are doing an absolutely amazing job delaying that day and trying to keep the game fresh, even through the hottest of hot takes about how the game is finally dying, but League of Legends will die someday. Not in the sense that nobody will be playing it, but in the sense that all things that were once popular someday won't be. People don't want the same things forever. Now, I'm not a doomsayer. With the work that Riot are putting in and the sheer size of the audience, I think League will be able to count its player base in the millions for many, many years to come, but someday, the world will move on around it. The average age of the player base will go up, the new audiences will be going somewhere else. And the only part of League of Legends that can break free and follow them is the story, the characters, the so-called intellectual property. This is the thing that can transform into a movie, a comic book, a novel, a 12-part series on Netflix, or indeed, another video game. 50 years from now, when we're not playing League anymore, I will still remember Braum and Jinx and Echo and all the others, but I'm not so sure I'll still think about the last ARAM I won. Your mileage may vary, but that's how my brain works at least. Stories matter, and Riot needs to do a lot better with theirs. This is the part where I'm supposed to synthesize and bring together everything we've talked about so far into some sort of unified conclusion, preferably with a hopeful note for the future. But I'm not gonna. I feel like I've said what needed to be said. Riot screwed up the lore. They failed to adhere to their ostensible policy of making the story a true pillar of their game design. Some of the reasons why are understandable, and some of them are awful, and the end result is that League of Legends is a worse game than it should have been. I don't think you can make an honest assessment of Riot's track record with their lore that isn't overwhelmingly about the many, many ways in which they've come up short. It's been frustrating to be a fan of the story of League of Legends, and making this video brought all that frustration right back to the surface of my mind. Hopefully, the writers at Riot will have the support they need from the company going forward, but historically, there's not a lot of precedent for Riot getting this right, and there's a whole lot of precedent for them getting it wrong. Boy, that's a bit of a bummer to end on, so here's a picture of some otters. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for taking the time to go through this massive topic with me, and thank you especially to my patrons on Patreon who voted on this video topic several months ago and who have waited exceptionally patiently for me to finish this video. If you would like to vote on future videos and also help me pay for frivolous luxuries like rent and food and stuff, I would be very grateful. If not, of course, that's completely okay. I'm just glad you watched this video at all. Subscribe if you're so inclined. You can hit the like button or the dislike button if you want to, and if you want to do me a favor, if you like this video, and if you think it's good, please share it with someone who you think might like to see it. Post it around. YouTube's algorithm doesn't reward creators for taking a long time to finish a video, so any help you can give me, I would be very grateful for. Anyway, I'm gonna go collapse on something and sleep for a very, very long time. Bye.